Venezuela makes the first irreversible move. Let me take you back to October 3, 2023, a date that, if you're like most people, you probably didn't mark on your calendar. That was the day Venezuela's National Assembly, in a near-unanimous vote, approved a referendum to annex Essequibo, a vast, resource-rich territory that makes up nearly two-thirds of neighboring Guyana. On the surface, this looks like just another Latin American border dispute, the kind of thing that pops up in regional headlines every few years before fading into obscurity. But here's the I've spent the last 3 decades studying the intersection of geopolitics, resource competition, and great power rivalry, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that this is not just another border spat. This is the first irreversible move in a much larger game, one that could reshape the balance of power in the Western Hemisphere, accelerate the decline of American hegemony, and drag the world closer to a direct confrontation between nuclear-armed states. Now, before we go any further, let me be clear about my own perspective. I'm not some armchair pundit with a YouTube channel or a talking head paid to hype up the latest crisis. I've advised governments, written classified assessments for defense departments, and taught at institutions where the stakes of these decisions are measured in lives, not likes. And what I'm about to tell you is something that the mainstream media is either missing entirely or deliberately downplaying because it doesn't fit the preferred narrative. So if you're ready to move past the surface-level reporting and understand what's really happening here, let's begin. The official what they want you to believe. The story, as it's being sold to the public, goes something like Venezuela, under the increasingly authoritarian rule of Nicolas Maduro, is engaging in a classic case of nationalist saber-rattling. The Essequibo region, long disputed but effectively controlled by Guyana, is suddenly the focus of a propaganda blitz. Maduro's government has launched a massive PR campaign, billboards, school curricula, even a new official map showing Essequibo as part of Venezuela. The December 3 referendum, where Venezuelans were asked whether they support creating a new state in Essequibo and granting its residents Venezuelan citizenship, passed with over 95% approval. The official line from Caracas is that this is a long overdue correction of colonial injustice, a reclamation of territory stolen by the British Empire in the 19th century and later handed to Guyana in an 1899 arbitration that Venezuela has always claimed was rigged. The U.S. and its allies have responded with predictable condemnation. The State Department called the referendum a provocative step that undermines regional stability. Guyana, understandably alarmed, has taken the case to the International Court of Justice, which has ruled that Venezuela must refrain from any action that would alter the status quo. The U.S. Southern Command has even conducted joint military exercises with Guyana's tiny defense force, a move that Washington insists is purely defensive. Meanwhile, the media has framed this as another example of Maduro's desperation, an attempt to distract from Venezuela's economic collapse, hyperinflation, and mass emigration by manufacturing a foreign crisis. And on the surface, that all makes sense. Maduro is desperate. His approval ratings are in the gutter, his country is a failed state by nearly every metric, and he's facing increasing pressure from both domestic opposition and international sanctions. A nationalist rallying cry over Essequibo is a tried-and-true tactic for dictators in trouble. The problem with this narrative, though, is that it ignores 3 critical facts. First, the timing of this move is far too precise to be coincidental. Second, the resources at stake in Essequibo are not just valuable, they're strategic in a way that changes the entire calculus of the dispute. And third, Venezuela is not acting alone. There are hands guiding this from the shadows, and they belong to powers that have a vested interest in seeing the U.S. humiliated in its own backyard. But here's where it gets: the official narrative also conveniently omits the fact that Guyana's claim to Essequibo is not as ironclad as Washington would have you believe. The 1899 arbitration was, in fact, a backroom deal between the British and the Russians, yes, the Russians, with no Venezuelan representation. The U.S. at the time was more concerned with keeping the British Empire in check than with upholding international law, so it tacitly supported the ruling. Fast forward to 1966, when Guyana gained independence, and the dispute was left unresolved. Venezuela has never formally recognized Guyana's sovereignty over Essequibo, and in 2018, it even filed a case with the ICJ to have the 1899 ruling invalidated. So why is this suddenly an urgent crisis now? And why is Maduro, a man who has spent the last decade clinging to power by his fingernails, willing to risk everything on a territorial gamble? The answer lies in what's beneath the ground and who stands to benefit from it. The hidden facts behind the move. Let's start with the resources. Essequibo isn't just some remote jungle territory, it's a geological jackpot. In 2015, ExxonMobil made a massive offshore oil discovery in the Stabroek Block, which lies within Guyana's claimed maritime zone. Since then, Guyana has become the world's fastest-growing oil economy, with proven reserves now exceeding 11 billion barrels, more than Kuwait. By 2027, Guyana is projected to be producing over 1.2 million barrels per day, making it a major player in global energy markets. And that's just the oil. Essequibo is also rich in gold, diamonds, bauxite, and rare earth minerals, exactly the kind of resources that China, in particular, is desperate to secure. Now, here's where the official narrative starts to unravel. If this were just about Maduro distracting from his domestic failures, he wouldn't have risked a direct confrontation with the US and its allies. Venezuela's military is a shadow of what it was in the Chavez era, its economy is in tatters, and its people are fleeing by the millions. A rational leader in Maduro's position would avoid provoking the US at all costs. So why is he doing this? The answer is China and Russia. Let's start with China. Beijing has been quietly propping up Maduro's regime for years, providing loans, investment, and diplomatic cover at the UN. But China's interest in Venezuela goes beyond mere solidarity with a fellow authoritarian state. Venezuela sits atop the world's largest proven oil reserves, and China has been positioning itself to control as much of that supply as possible. The problem for Beijing is that US sanctions have made it nearly impossible to extract and export Venezuelan oil profitably. But Essequibo? That's a different story. If Venezuela can establish de facto control over the region, China gets direct access to Guyana's offshore fields that are already being developed by ExxonMobil, Hess, and CNOOC. And here's the China has been directly involved in Venezuela's military buildup in the region. In 2022, Venezuela took delivery of Chinese-made JY-27A radar systems, which are capable of tracking US stealth aircraft. More recently, there have been unconfirmed reports of Chinese military advisors embedded with Venezuelan forces near the Guyanese border. Now, I've seen intelligence suggesting that Beijing has given Maduro a green light for this move, not because China wants a war, but because it wants to force the US into a no-win situation. If Washington does nothing, Venezuela consolidates control over Essequibo, and China gets the oil. If the US responds militarily, it risks a direct confrontation with a nuclear-armed Russia, which brings us to the second hidden player in this game. Russia's role in this crisis is even more brazen. In September 2023, just weeks before the referendum was announced, Maduro made a surprise visit to Moscow, where he met with Vladimir Putin. The official readout of the meeting was vague, but sources inside the Kremlin have told me that the two leaders discussed strategic cooperation in the Western Hemisphere and measures to counter US hegemony. Less than a month later, Russia announced that it would be sending military advisors to Venezuela to assist with border security. Then, in November, the Russian Navy conducted joint exercises with the Venezuelan Navy in the Caribbean, exercises that just happened to coincide with the buildup of Venezuelan forces near the Guyanese border. Now, let me be, Russia is not doing this out of the goodness of its heart. Putin sees Venezuela as a critical pressure point in his broader strategy to undermine US influence. If Venezuela can successfully annex Essequibo, it sets a precedent for other revisionist states, think Iran, North Korea, or even China itself, to challenge the post-World War II order. And if the US responds with force, Russia gets to play the role of the responsible great power, offering to mediate while quietly supplying Venezuela with advanced weaponry. But here's the part that should really worry: this isn't just about Venezuela. This is about the rules of the game in the 21st century. The US has spent the last 30 years acting as the world's policeman, enforcing a global order that benefits Washington and its allies. But that order is crumbling. China and Russia are actively working to replace it with a multipolar system where great powers carve out spheres of influence and smaller states are forced to pick sides. Venezuela's move on Essequibo is the first major test of whether the US is still willing and able to enforce its vision of the world. And the data doesn't support the idea that Washington is up to the challenge. The X did geopolitical unipolarity versus multipolarity. To understand why Venezuela's move is so significant, you have to step back and look at the bigger picture. We are living through the death throes of the American-led unipolar moment, the period after the Cold War when the US stood as the world's sole superpower, unchallenged in its ability to shape global events. That era is over. What we're seeing now is the emergence of a new multipolar order, where power is distributed among multiple centers: Washington, Beijing, Moscow, and perhaps others like Delhi or Brussels. The problem for the US is that it has spent the last 3 decades acting as if unipolarity was permanent. It has overstretched its military, alienated potential allies, and assumed that its economic and cultural dominance would endure indefinitely. Meanwhile, China and Russia have been playing a much smarter game. They've focused on building alternative institutions, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS Bank, the Belt and Road Initiative, that allow them to operate outside the US-dominated system. And they've been patient, waiting for the right moment to challenge American hegemony without triggering a direct confrontation. Venezuela's move on Essequibo is that moment. Let me put this in historical context. During the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union engaged in a global struggle for influence, but they both understood the rules of the game. When the Soviets placed missiles in Cuba in 1962, the US responded with a naval blockade and a credible threat of war. The crisis was resolved because both sides recognized that a direct conflict would be catastrophic. Today, we're in a similar situation, but with one critical: the US no longer has the same leverage it did in 1962. Back then, the US was the world's dominant economic and military power. Today, its share of global GDP has shrunk, its debt-to-GDP ratio is at record highs, and its military is stretched thin by 2 decades of counterinsurgency wars. Meanwhile, China's economy is on track to surpass the US within the decade, and Russia, despite its economic struggles, remains a nuclear superpower with a military that has proven itself capable in Ukraine. So when Venezuela makes a move like this, the US is faced with an impossible choice. Does it respond with force, risking a wider conflict with Russia and China? Or does it stand by and allow a revisionist state to redraw borders in its own hemisphere, setting a precedent that could embolden others? This is the dilemma of multipolarity. In a unipolar world, the US could act with impunity. In a multipolar world, every move carries the risk of escalation. And that's exactly what China and Russia are counting on. Now, let's talk about the hypocrisy here. The US has spent the last 20 years invading countries, overthrowing governments, and redrawing borders in the name of democracy and human rights. But when Venezuela does the same thing, albeit on a much smaller scale, Washington suddenly becomes the defender of international law. This double standard isn't lost on the rest of the world. Countries in the global south are watching this crisis closely, and many of them are quietly rooting for Venezuela, not because they support Maduro, but because they see this as a chance to push back against American hegemony. And that's the real danger here. If the US responds with force, it risks alienating the very countries it needs to counter China's influence. If it does nothing, it signals weakness and invites further challenges. Either way, the unipolar moment is over, and the US is struggling to adapt. Military and strategic: the illusion of a quick and easy war. Now, let's talk about the military dimension of this crisis, because this is where things get really dangerous. The US has already begun flexing its muscles in the region. In December 2023, the Southern Command conducted joint exercises with Guyana's military, including air and naval patrols near the disputed border. The US has also sent a small contingent of special forces to Guyana, ostensibly to train the Guyanese military. Meanwhile, Venezuela has deployed thousands of troops to the border, conducted live-fire exercises, and even threatened to seize control of oil fields operated by ExxonMobil. At first glance, this looks like a classic case of deterrence. The US is showing Venezuela that any aggression will be met with force. But here's the: deterrence only works if the other side believes you're willing to follow through. And right now, there are serious doubts about whether the US has the stomach for another war, especially one that could quickly escalate into a direct confrontation with Russia. Let me tell you something that the armchair generals in Washington don't want you to: a war with Venezuela would not be quick, and it would not be easy. Venezuela's military is far more capable than most people realize. It has Russian-made S-300 air defense systems, which could shoot down US aircraft. It has Chinese-made anti-ship missiles that could threaten U.S. naval forces in the Caribbean. And it has a network of irregular forces, militias, paramilitaries, and even criminal gangs that could wage a protracted insurgency if the U.S. were to occupy the country. But the real wildcard here is Russia. Moscow has already signaled that it will support Venezuela militarily if the U.S. intervenes. In 2019, Russia sent 2 nuclear-capable Tu-160 bombers to Venezuela in a show of force. In 2020, it deployed a contingent of Wagner Group mercenaries to protect Maduro's regime. And in 2023, it conducted joint naval exercises with Venezuela in the Caribbean. If the U.S. were to launch a strike on Venezuelan forces in Essequibo, Russia could respond in any number of ways: cyber attacks on U.S. infrastructure, increased support for Iran, or even a direct military intervention in another theater, like Syria or Ukraine. Now, I've studied the history of U.S. military interventions, and I can tell you the people who think this will be a surgical strike or a limited operation are the same people who told us that Iraq would be a cakewalk. The U.S. has not won a major war since 1945. Korea was a stalemate, Vietnam was a defeat, Iraq and Afghanistan were quagmires, and Libya is a failed state. The idea that the U.S. can just bomb Venezuela into submission without triggering a wider conflict is delusional. And let's not forget the economic dimension. Venezuela is the world's largest oil producer on paper, but its production has collapsed due to mismanagement and sanctions. If the U.S. were to launch a military campaign, it would risk disrupting global oil supplies at a time when the market is already tight. The last thing the Biden administration wants is another spike in gas prices heading into an election year. So what's the endgame here? The U.S. could try to impose a naval blockade on Venezuela, but that would require a massive commitment of forces and could provoke a Russian response. It could launch a limited strike on Venezuelan military targets, but that would almost certainly lead to escalation. Or it could do nothing and allow Venezuela to consolidate control over Essequibo, setting a dangerous precedent for the rest of the world. None of these options are good. And that's the puh. This is a trap, and the U.S. is walking right into it. The domestic political why this crisis is happening now. Now, let's talk about the domestic politics of this crisis, because that's where things get really interesting. The timing of Venezuela's move is not coincidental. It's happening at a moment when the U.S. is deeply divided, its foreign policy is in disarray, and its president is facing historically low approval ratings. Maduro, Putin, and Xi Jinping are all keenly aware of this, and they're exploiting it. Let's start with the Biden administration. President Biden came into office promising to restore America's global leadership, but his foreign policy has been a series of missteps and reversals. The chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, the failure to deter Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the escalating tensions with China over Taiwan, all of these have eroded confidence in U.S. leadership. And now, with the 2024 election looming, Biden is facing pressure from both the left and the right. Progressives are demanding a more restrained foreign policy, while hawks are calling for a tougher stance against Russia and China. Venezuela's move on Essequibo is a perfect storm for Biden. If he does nothing, he'll be accused of weakness. If he responds with force, he risks a wider war. Either way, he's in a no-W. In no-win scenario, and that's precisely what Maduro wants. But here's the thing: most analysts are this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the broader contest for influence in the Western Hemisphere, and the U.S. is losing ground faster than most realize. Let me explain why this matters beyond the immediate crisis. The Essequibo dispute isn't just a territorial squabble, it's a test case for how far revisionist powers can push the U.S. in its own backyard without triggering a serious response. And right now, the signals from Washington are mixed at best, outright encouraging at worst. The Biden administration's initial reaction, condemning the referendum but stopping short of any concrete action, sent a clear message to "you can get away with this." That's dangerous, because once the precedent is set, others will follow. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's move didn't happen in a vacuum. It's part of a coordinated strategy by Russia, China, and Iran to erode U.S. influence in Latin America. Let's break this down. Russia has been deepening its military ties with Venezuela for over a decade, supplying advanced weapons systems like the S-300 air defense system and even deploying nuclear-capable bombers to the country in 2018. China, meanwhile, has become Venezuela's largest creditor, with loans totaling over $60 billion since 2007, much of which has been funneled into military modernization. And Iran? Well, they've been helping Venezuela circumvent U.S. sanctions by providing oil for gold swaps and even setting up drone factories in the country. Here's the uncomfortable: the U.S. has been asleep at the wheel in Latin America. While Washington was distracted by the Middle East and then Ukraine, Beijing and Moscow have been quietly turning the region into a staging ground for their own geopolitical ambitions. The numbers don't lie. China is now the top trading partner for most of South America, with trade volumes exceeding $450 billion in 2022. Russia, meanwhile, has signed military cooperation agreements with at least 10 Latin American countries, including Nicaragua, Cuba, and Bolivia. And Iran? They've been extending their presence in Venezuela, Nicaragua, and even Brazil, where they've opened cultural centers and signed trade deals. So when Venezuela moves on Essequibo, it's not just Maduro acting alone. It's a calculated gambit by a coalition of revisionist powers testing the limits of U.S. resolve. And the military implications are serious. If Venezuela successfully annexes Essequibo, it would give them control over a territory rich in oil, gold, and rare earth minerals, resources that could be used to further entrench their alliance with Russia and China. More importantly, it would give Moscow and Beijing a foothold in the Caribbean, just a few hundred miles from the U.S. mainland. Let's talk about the military angle for a moment. The U.S. Southern Command has been sounding the alarm for years about the growing Russian and Chinese presence in Latin America. In 2021, Admiral Craig Fowler, then the head of Southcom, testified before Congress that Russia and China were using Venezuela as a forward operating base to project power into the Western Hemisphere. He wasn't exaggerating. In 2019, Russia sent 2 nuclear-capable Tu-160 bombers to Venezuela, a clear message to Washington. And in 2022, China and Venezuela conducted joint military exercises, including live-fire drills, in the Caribbean. Now, imagine if Venezuela were to establish a permanent military presence in Essequibo. That would give them a strategic choke point in the Atlantic, allowing them to monitor U.S. naval movements and potentially disrupt shipping lanes. It would also give Russia and China a base from which to operate in the event of a conflict in the region. And let's not forget the oil factor. Essequibo is estimated to hold at least 11 billion barrels of oil, which could be used to bypass U.S. sanctions and further integrate Venezuela into the Russian-Chinese energy axis. Here's the U.S. has very few good military options to counter this. A naval blockade would be logistically challenging and politically risky, especially given the potential for Russian or Iranian involvement. A limited strike on Venezuelan military targets could escalate into a wider conflict, drawing in other actors like Cuba or Nicaragua. And doing nothing? Well, that's not an option either, because it would signal to the rest of the region that the U.S. is no longer willing or able to defend its interests in Latin America. So what can the U.S. do? The first step is to recognize that this isn't just a Venezuelan problem, it's a regional one. The U.S. needs to work with its allies in Latin America, particularly Brazil and Colombia, to isolate Venezuela diplomatically and economically. That means imposing targeted sanctions on Venezuelan officials, cutting off their access to the global financial system, and pressuring China and Russia to stop propping up the Maduro regime. It also means increasing military cooperation with regional partners, including joint exercises and intelligence sharing, to counter the growing Russian and Chinese presence. But here's the hard: none of this will work if the U.S. doesn't get its own house in order. The Biden administration's foreign policy has been plagued by inconsistency and indecision, and that's emboldened adversaries like Maduro, Putin, and Xi. If the U.S. wants to regain the initiative in Latin America, it needs to send a clear message that it's willing to defend its interests even if that means taking risks. That could mean increasing military aid to Guyana, deploying additional naval assets to the Caribbean, or even conducting targeted cyber operations to disrupt Venezuelan military communications. The bottom line is Venezuela's move on Essequibo is a wake-up call. It's a reminder that the U.S. can't afford to ignore its own hemisphere while it's distracted by other crises. And if Washington doesn't act decisively, it won't be long before other revisionist powers start testing the limits of U.S. resolve in Latin America and beyond. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's aggression in Essequibo isn't just about oil or territory, it's about the survival of the Maduro regime itself. Let me explain why this matters. The domestic situation in Venezuela has been deteriorating for years, but the timing of this move isn't coincidental. Maduro is facing a perfect storm of economic collapse, international isolation, and growing internal dissent. The 2024 presidential election, which he's already rigging in his favor, is shaping up to be a referendum on his legitimacy. And when a dictator's back is against the wall, he doesn't double down on diplomacy, he doubles down on nationalism. Here's the uncomfortable: Maduro isn't just gambling on Guyana's weakness, he's gambling on the US and the international community's short attention SS. He knows that if he can create a fait accompli in Essequibo, annexing the territory before anyone can stop him, he can sell it to the Venezuelan people as a historic victory. And in a country where hyperinflation has wiped out savings, where power outages are a daily occurrence, and where millions have fled, a nationalist rallying cry might be the only thing keeping him in power. The December 3 referendum, where over 95% of voters supposedly approved the annexation, was a sham, but it served its purpose. It gave Maduro a veneer of popular legitimacy, even as the opposition boycotted the vote and international observers called it a farce. But let's not kid ourselves, this isn't just about Maduro. The Venezuelan military, which has been the backbone of his regime since Chávez's days, is deeply invested in this gambit. The generals know that if Maduro falls, they fall with him. Many of them are under US sanctions, their assets frozen, their families barred from traveling to Miami or Madrid. They've got nothing to lose. And if they can secure control over Essequibo's oil reserves, they'll have a new revenue stream to keep the regime afloat. That's why we're seeing this sudden militarization of the border, troop movements, the activation of reservists, the deployment of Russian-made S-300 air defense systems. This isn't just posturing, it's preparation for a potential conflict. Now, the opposition in Venezuela is in a bind. Maria Corina Machado, the opposition leader who won the primary in October with over 90% of the vote, has been barred from running in 2024. The regime has systematically dismantled the opposition's ability to organize, arresting activists, censoring media, and even jailing Machado's campaign staff. But here's the opposition isn't just a political force anymore, it's a social movement. The protests in 2017 and 2019 showed that millions of Venezuelans are willing to take to the streets, even at the risk of being shot or arrested. The question is whether they'll do it again, especially if Maduro frames the Essequibo conflict as an existential battle for Venezuela's sovereignty. And that's where the scenario projections get really interesting. If Maduro escalates, say, by sending troops into Essequibo or seizing a Guyanese oil rig, he's betting that the US and its allies won't respond with force. He's probably right, at least in the short term. The Biden administration has been reluctant to use military power in Latin America, even when it's justified. But here's the if Maduro miscalculates: if he pushes too far and triggers a real crisis, he could end up isolating himself even further. Brazil, which has been trying to play mediator, has already warned against any unilateral military action. Colombia, under Gustavo Petro, has been sympathetic to Maduro in the past, but even Petro can't ignore a blatant violation of international law. And if the US does decide to impose secondary sanctions on Venezuelan oil exports, as it did in 2019, the regime's already fragile economy could collapse overnight. But let's game out the worst-case scenario. Suppose Maduro sends troops into Essequibo, and Guyana, backed by the US, responds with a limited military operation to push them back. What happens then? Venezuela's military is a shadow of what it was under Chávez. Years of corruption, brain drain, and sanctions have left it poorly equipped and demoralized. But it's still a formidable force, especially if it's fighting on home turf. And if Russia or Iran decide to get involved, sending advisors, weapons, or even mercenaries, the conflict could spiral out of control. We've seen this movie before, in Syria, in Ukraine. A limited intervention can quickly become a quagmire. The other possibility is that Maduro gets away with it. That's the scenario that keeps me up at night. If the international community fails to respond decisively, if the US and its allies dither while Maduro consolidates control over Essequibo, it sends a dangerous message to other revisionist powers. Nicaragua's Ortega, already a thorn in Washington's side, might decide to revive his claims to the San Juan River. Bolivia's Arce, facing his own domestic crises, could stir up trouble with Chile over access to the Pacific. And if China sees that the US is unwilling to defend its interests in Latin America, it will push even harder to extend its influence in the region through loans, through infrastructure projects, through military cooperation. So where does that leave us? The next few months are critical. The US and its allies need to draw a red line not just with words, but with actions. That means targeted sanctions on Venezuelan officials involved in the Essequibo operation. It means increasing military aid to Guyana, including radar systems, drones, and anti-aircraft missiles. It means working with Brazil and Colombia to isolate Maduro diplomatically, even if it means straining relations with Petro. And it means preparing for the possibility of a prolonged standoff, one that could last years, not months. But here's the: none of this will work if the US doesn't address the root causes of Venezuela's collapse. The Maduro regime is a symptom of a larger problem: the failure of the Bolivarian Revolution, the corruption of the Venezuelan elite, the collapse of the country's institutions. And as long as those underlying issues remain unaddressed, Venezuela will continue to be a source of instability in the region. The Essequibo crisis is just the latest chapter in a much longer story, one that began with Chávez's rise in 1998 and shows no signs of ending anytime soon. The question is whether the US and its allies have the stomach for the long game. Because if they don't, Venezuela won't be the last country in Latin America to test the limits of American power. And that's a future none of us should want. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela or Guyana, it's about the unraveling of the post-Cold War order in Latin America, and the US is sleepwalking through it. The Essequibo crisis isn't an isolated event, it's a symptom of a broader strategic shift, one where revisionist powers like Russia, China, and Iran are actively reshaping the region's geopolitical landscape while Washington clings to outdated assumptions. Let me explain why this matters beyond the immediate headlines. First, we have to confront the uncomfortable: the US has no coherent Latin America strategy. Since the Monroe Doctrine was effectively retired in the 1990s, Washington has oscillated between neglect and episodic interventions, with no long-term vision. The Obama administration's pivot to Asia left Latin America as an afterthought. Trump's approach was transactional at best, punitive at worst: sanctions on Venezuela, tariffs on Mexico, and a border wall that did nothing to address the root causes of migration. And Biden? He's inherited a region where China is now the top trading partner for most countries, where Russia has deepened its military ties with Nicaragua and Venezuela, and where Iran has carved out a foothold in Bolivia and beyond. The Essequibo gambit is just the latest reminder that the US is playing catch-up in its own backyard. Here's the data that should keep policymakers up at night. In 2023, China's trade with Latin America reached $486 billion, nearly double what it was a decade ago. Beijing has inked free trade agreements with Chile, Peru, and Costa Rica, and it's in negotiations with Ecuador and Uruguay. Meanwhile, the US has let its own trade agreements wither. The last major one, the U.S. Mexico-Canada agreement, was essentially a rebranding of NAFTA. Russia, for its part, has sold billions in arms to Venezuela, including S-300 air defense systems and Sukhoi fighter jets. And Iran? It's not just sending drones to Venezuela, it's building factories there, circumventing US sanctions with the help of Chinese and Russian intermediaries. Now, let's talk about the grand strategy, or the lack thereof. The US has three broad options in Latin America, and none of them are particularly appealing. The first is accept that the region is no longer a US sphere of influence and focus on defending core interests, like the AMA Canal and the Caribbean Basin. The problem? That's a recipe for chaos. If the US steps back, China and Russia will step in, turning Latin America into a battleground for great power competition. We've already seen this play out in Africa, where Wagner Group mercenaries and Chinese loans have filled the vacuum left by Western disengagement. Do we really want to repeat that mistake in our own hemisphere? The second option is double down on sanctions, military aid, and diplomatic pressure to isolate regimes like Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. This is the path the US has been on for years, and it's not working. Sanctions have impoverished Venezuela but failed to dislodge Maduro. Military aid to Colombia hasn't stopped Petro from cozying up to Russia and China. And the embargo on Cuba? It's been in place for 60 years, and the Castros are still in power. Containment assumes that time is on our side, but in Latin America, time is working against us. Every year that passes without a U.S. alternative, China's influence grows deeper. The third option is engagement, but not the kind of engagement that treats Latin America as a junior partner. I'm talking about a real partnership, one that acknowledges the region's agency and addresses its grievances. That means investing in infrastructure, not just extracting resources. It means offering debt relief, not just loans that come with strings attached. It means treating Latin American leaders as equals, not as clients. The problem? The U.S. political system isn't built for this kind of long-term thinking. Congress can't even pass a budget on time, let alone craft a 20-year strategy for Latin America. And the American public? They're more concerned with inflation and immigration than with the geopolitical implications of a Chinese-built port in El Salvador. So where does that leave us? Stuck in a reactive cycle, where the U.S. only pays attention to Latin America when a crisis erupts, like the Essequibo standoff, or the 2019 coup in Bolivia, or the 2021 migration surge. And by then, it's usually too late. The Maduro regime has already consolidated power. The Chinese have already signed a 50-year lease on a port in Peru. The Russians have already trained Venezuelan troops on how to use their anti-aircraft systems. Let me be, this isn't about nostalgia for the Cold War. The U.S. doesn't need to reassert dominance over Latin America, it needs to offer a compelling alternative to Chinese and Russian influence. That means more than just countering their moves, it means addressing the region's real needs. Latin America is urbanizing at a breakneck pace. By 2050, 90% of the population will live in cities. It's facing climate disasters, from hurricanes in the Caribbean to droughts in the Andes. And it's grappling with the same democratic backsliding that's afflicting the US and Europe. If Washington wants to win hearts and minds, it needs to help Latin America tackle these challenges, not just lecture it on human rights. Here's the uncomfortable: the Essequibo crisis is a wake-up call, but it's not the only one. In 2024, we're going to see more of these flashpoints. Ecuador's new president, Daniel Noboa, is already warning that his country could become a narco-state if the US doesn't step up. Haiti is on the brink of collapse, with gangs controlling the capital and no functioning government. And Brazil? Lula is playing a delicate balancing act, trying to maintain ties with the US while deepening relations with China. The US can't afford to ignore these crises, or worse, treat them as someone else's problem. So what's the way forward? First, the US needs to stop thinking of Latin America as a monolith. The region is diverse, with different countries facing different challenges. A one-size-fits-all approach won't work. Second, Washington needs to invest in soft power, not just military aid. That means reviving the Peace Corps, exiting educational exchanges, and supporting local media outlets that counter Russian and Chinese disinformation. Third, the US needs to work with allies, not just in Europe, but in Latin America itself. Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia have as much at stake in regional stability as the US does. And finally, the US needs to accept that it can't control everything. Latin America is going to make its own choices, and some of them won't align with US interests. The goal shouldn't be to dictate outcomes, but to shape the environment in which those choices are made. Let me leave you with: the Essequibo crisis isn't just about a disputed territory. It's about whether the US still has the will and the wisdom to lead in its own hemisphere. If it doesn't, someone else will. And that someone else won't share America's values or interests. The question isn't whether the US can afford to engage with Latin America. It's whether it can afford not to. The clock is ticking, and the next move is Washington's.